So trauma to me is any experience that's too big for your brain to metabolize. I think we overvalue the clinical definitions, and people get all hung up on like trauma is overdiagnosed nowadays and not everything is traumatic. But the idea is if an experience just rocked your world, if you just said, "Oh my gosh, what just happened?" Trauma happens in the future. So sometimes we expect a kid to show signs of trauma in the immediate aftermath of something, right? Somebody died in their family, we expect them to come to school the next week. And sometimes it doesn't actually land till years, months, weeks. It could land so much later, like when your brain matures enough to understand the implications of what happened. Very often, that's when trauma happens.
Hi there, you're listening to our guest this week, Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, the Educational Director of the Targeted Parenting Institute in New Jersey. And I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. Our conversation with Dr. K was so rich that we divided it up, and the second part will be coming out next week. Now, Dr. K talks about how schools can become trauma-informed, recognizing the signs of trauma in students and creating mechanisms to support students effectively. She also points out the importance of implementing social emotional learning, or SEL, in schools, along with strategies to manage student emotions and resolve conflicts.
Today's podcast is brought to you by the word trauma from the Greek, which means wound or damage. In ancient Greek, it referred specifically to a physical injury. Physicians like Hippocrates used trauma to describe bodily injuries. It wasn't until the 20th century that the term began to be used to describe psychological and emotional wounds.
At the end of this episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca, where you can find lots of relational resources. And if you enjoy this episode, make sure you subscribe on Spotify. We had some technical issues that even technical experts weren't able to resolve with syncing the video with the audio. So just sit back and listen. Close your eyes, unless, of course, you're driving. So Shelley's away, so let's head over to this discussion with Steve and me, Stan. Welcome, Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about all the things we're going to be talking about today.
Excellent. I wonder if we can maybe just start with your story. What is it about your story, your experiences that also led to, and we'll get to talking about a new book that you're writing, but what is it that you've experienced that led to this book?
So I really basically wrote the book that I would have needed when I became a mom. So 26 years ago, when I became a mom, I was a graduate student at the time, and I remember the nurses looking at me in the hospital and saying, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, at that point, I was working on a very large National Institute of Health study on child development. I said, I'm in school to become a clinical child psychologist, and I'm working on this study of children's temperament and child development. And one of the nurses joked like, "Oh, this baby's so lucky. She's being parented by someone who's like an expert in the field. Isn't she lucky?" And she left the room. And everyone chuckles, and she leaves the room, and I just burst into tears because I knew that I had very bad PTSD. And I did not know how my PTSD was going to impact my baby. I knew it would have to. So being like a research geek, I went to the library because that's what one does when you're like a researcher by nature. And there was nothing. There was no academic study, no books. I'm not even sure if Bessel van der Kolk had written The Body Keeps the Score yet. That's where trauma research was at. It was in its real infancy. So it wasn't like the buzzword that it is now. And there was nothing about the impact of specifically PTSD on parenting. But I knew that if I'm having flashbacks all the time and your baby needs that calm, present, attuned parent, then I'm going to have a flashback holding this baby. What is it going to do to her? And that really just started this journey of figuring it out. Like at the time, another really funny thing, I was working in a school for behaviorally disordered youth. And I was also working in a clinic because in the hospital, you have to pick your specialties and your rotations. I was working in a clinic for kids with enuresis and encopresis. And I realized later that, oh, I'm studying the impact of trauma on child development. Because if you're working in a school for kids with acting out behaviors, and then you're working in a clinic for kids who can't control their bowels, you are working with trauma pretty much 100% of the time.
What kind of an impact did the trauma, as you observed it and experienced it, have on your parenting?
So trauma to me is any experience that's too big for your brain to metabolize. I think we overvalue the clinical definitions, and people get all hung up on like trauma is overdiagnosed nowadays and not everything is traumatic. But the idea is, if an experience just rocked your world, if you just said, oh my gosh, what just happened? And my entire world has changed now. I can't take it in. Like, what happened to me? You're traumatized. And whether you're traumatized and then you're going to cope with it in a more resilient fashion, that's going to depend on the supports you get, because one of the big components of trauma and complex trauma is how alone do you feel with that trauma. The thing about complex trauma is, while things are happening to you, what isn't happening for you? And I think that is the big distinction, right? Because when a child is growing up, their brain is primed to expect certain sort of normal stressors and certain normative, shall we say, attachment experiences, that parents are mostly good and kind and attentive, that there's food, that there's safety, that there's shelter, that there's predictability. So if there aren't those things, there may not be that discrete trauma, like that moment of abuse, but there may be the cumulative damage of everything that's not happening for this brain that is expecting it. A lot of times, especially with administrators, I have them free associate. And if your free associations of things like mom, dad, dinner time, holidays, summertime, school are mostly positive words, you might not understand that kid where the word dad connotes the most terrifying person ever. And that, I think, is the kind of thing where if you haven't experienced that kind of developmental trauma, it's really hard to wrap your brain around it. I'll even give you an interesting example. I was consulting in a faith-based school, and there was a teacher who said, that's kind of typical faith-based thing, God is our Father in heaven, right? And what he was going for, I would assume, is a positive association of a fatherly figure who could perhaps be stern. I am not of that person's faith, so I don't know all of their connotations, but on the whole, I'm assuming fatherly person who is kind but maybe stern. And this one kid had this reaction where it was like, well, in that case, I'm never being religious, because wait, my dad who abuses me but with cosmic powers, I'm out. Saying this to this principal, yeah, I'm done with religion. And the principal didn't have the presence of mind at the moment to say why, which is the most important thing. Why? Mm-hmm. Because there's the answer. Because when I asked the kid why, he's, yeah, like someone who hits me with a belt, except the belt is made out of, I don't know, cosmic powers. I don't want that. I get you, kid. I wouldn't either.
Yeah, no kidding.
It makes me think of a lot of the work that we did for years and years and years with restorative practice, and trying to promote conversations in the classroom with sentence starters and all these kind of things. And after quite a few years of doing it, we realized that a lot of these lists that we had of here's some great starters for conversations were actually could be trauma inducing for a lot of the children in our classrooms. And we started to change our list. And one of the schools I was at, we just stopped doing Mother's Day and Father's Day, because too many kids were from separated families, from multi-partner families. They weren't living with their real mother, their natural mother, or with a step parent. And it just became almost trauma inducing for a large number of the kids in our school. So we stopped doing that kind of thing. In Canada, we're dealing with our Indigenous population with multi-generational trauma. Indigenous people who were sent to residential schools who didn't have parenting. They were never parented themselves, so when they became parents, didn't know what to do, and the cycle just continued and continued. So I like your definition of trauma. How do we recognize that, and how do we as an administrator of the school manage that when the teacher comes and says, I don't know what to do?
Yeah. So I like having a mechanism for kids to be able to signal the teacher. I like to use, like, in the US, we have 911 for emergency phone calls. So like a 911, 811, 711 system. or a 1, 2, 3 level, where if I absolutely need to leave the classroom and talk to a trusted adult because I know that triggered me and that upset me, or I need the teacher's attention as quickly as possible, and I want to give kids like mechanisms for signaling the level of stress they're feeling, particularly when we know there's a stress. We don't always know there's a stress. Right? There might be a family that seems very functional on the surface, but there's all sorts of stress going on. I actually talk about that in the book. There's, the famous ACEs study, the idea of adverse childhood experiences. So I also talk about SACEs, which are secret ACEs, which are the adverse childhood experiences that don't make it onto that list. Like having a parent who's a functional alcoholic, where the family seems so perfect on the surface, but everyone's tiptoeing around dad's hangover, right? Or some other type of major stressor. There's stepmom has borderline personality disorder and she just belittles one kid, right? And I don't mean to gender it because stepdad could also, and right, but like that kind of thing where the family seems fine and really there's some stressor going on. But when we do know there's ACEs, particularly saying to kids, if something triggered you, if something was hard for you, then you have this mechanism to signal to me that you need to talk later, or you need to talk right now, or you need to go someplace safe. So that way we can open up a difficult conversation when we know there's a safety valve. But also we're not expecting you to then go to like science class next. Like we watched this video that really triggered you, and then you're just supposed to go off to science because that's the next period. There must be if we're going to open the doors to things like SEL, where we're going to talk about emotions, then we have to be able to give kids a mechanism for somewhere to go with that. And maybe it's a communication box, and maybe every school, depending on the amount of tech available, maybe it's a texting system with the teacher where you can send them a message and let them know, go to a safe space in the back of the room. That's why we do these things. People make it, when you were saying about like Mother's Day, Father's Day, the same people I feel like who object to social and emotional learning object to renaming that to Generation Day or bring an important adult to school day. And I lost a parent as a child. That was a lot of what my PTSD had to do with. And I didn't want people to like necessarily tiptoe around my loss, but at the same token, it would have been nice occasionally if someone had checked in with me and said, is this okay? Are you okay? Do you need to talk? Just that simple human understanding. Why call it Mother's Day if someone lost a mother? Why not call it Bring an Important Adult Day? Like, why would we cause pain to some innocent third grader because it was always called Mother's Day? Okay, and now it's not. Now it's called Important Adult Tea.
And as an adult, then, how do you go about recognizing the signs of in students? What is it that you're looking for that will help you to put these sort of escape mechanisms into place?
So the first thing I like to do is say that trauma doesn't happen in the past, it happens in the future. So sometimes we expect a kid to show signs of trauma in the immediate aftermath of something, right? Somebody died in their family, we expect them to come to school the next week. And sometimes it doesn't actually land till years, months, weeks. It could land so much later, like when your brain matures enough to understand the implications of what happened. Very often that's when trauma happens. So it's not about looking for the red flags. It's more about, although I'll tell you about the red flags in a second, but it's more about creating a culture where you can come to me with something. And I'm not going to minimize what you're saying. And I'm not going to do that resilience, can-do, toxic positivity of, yeah, you can, you'll overcome it, shake it off, let's go. I'm going to hear you out. Because you know what? If I hear you out, you probably will shake it off and be able to keep going. If I just hear you out, you'll be like, there's that wonderful scene in the movie Inside Out where, in the first one, where there's the imaginary friend Bing Bong and he's very sad about something. And Joy is like, let's go, let's keep our journey going. Because it's like the hero's journey kind of thing. And Sadness says, you're sad, tell me about it. And then he tells Sadness about what he's sad about, and then he can move on. So if we have that mechanism, then we don't have to look for the red flags because the kid can come and tell us. But the red flags that I'm usually looking for in children is, first of all, anytime you lose a developmental milestone, I get very worried because that's either very organically wrong with you, right? If you were dry at night for years and suddenly you're wetting the bed, or if you were speaking and then suddenly in second grade you stop speaking, something major is lost, I worry because it's either organically something's wrong in your brain or something happened to you. That's not even a question. No one suddenly becomes, mute in second grade without there having been some catalyst for that. With adults, we're really looking for disproportionate reactions. So if you're really very overly reacting onto something where usually you're more unflappable, we have to wonder, what is it about that situation and what is it about that story? But the key is, in the same way we do this with kids, we're not coming from the place of what's wrong with you that you're overreacting. We're coming from the place of what happened to you that this is a hot button topic for you. Why is this so hard for you? Right? And so we're not coming from the place of, I figured out what's wrong with you. Right? We're coming from the place of, okay, you really find bullying amongst your third grade students difficult to handle, whereas you handle kids talking in class or people not doing their homework or a mother being difficult to work with or challenging. You handle those fine. But when you see a kid bullying another kid, you really, you feel like you need to swoop in and monitor the situation and have drastic consequences. What's up with you about bullying? Help me understand that.
I love that.
And then
place
your
to start.
colleagues are much more willing to talk. Yeah.
Yeah, that just completely resonates with where we're coming from in terms of restorative practice. Because the very first question that we suggest, and it is transformative for people, is just what happened. Yeah. And you can add the what happened to you that made this so challenging, what happened to you, or what's happening in this situation. But it's all a version of a question, not a judgment. Because judgment shuts it down.
I'll give you a story that happened in a school I consult in, because the story has so many levels. So I was consulting in this school, and there's this teacher of the kindergarten age, the age right before first grade, because every district has another name for that. This teacher was a wonderful teacher. And I have this rule that you can never use pejorative language to refer to any child. So if a kid is the class queen, she has leadership abilities that she's not using properly. I want to frame it in terms of the problem, as opposed to she's a drama queen, or she's the class queen, or he's so controlling. I once had someone tell me a fifth grader has narcissistic personality disorder. He's a fifth grader. You don't have a personality until you're 21. So you can't have a disorder in something you don't have. So he doesn't have narcissistic personality disorder. He has extreme difficulty relating to the needs of other humans around him. Why? That's the way we talk about this. But this teacher, she really was a wonderful teacher and had a very kind, supportive classroom. There was one girl in the class who was constantly chewing on her collar and chewing on her hair and sucking her thumb, picking her nose. And this teacher would say things like, when another child wouldn't take this child's hand, she would say, I understand. It's gross. She's gross. Like, why would she want to touch her? And I realized this teacher she was somewhat germophobic. And in the post-COVID era, I can understand that. But I couldn't get this teacher to stop referring to this child in these mildly pejorative terms. And I actually had the school move the kid to the other class. But then I sat down with the teacher and I said, you're able to do this with everybody, except for this girl. Tell me about germs. Help me understand this. And then she told me about caring for a sick family member who had an autoimmune deficiency and who had an immune deficiency, there's really ill, and how the measures she has to take to keep this person safe, and what the stress on her is being a caregiver, right? And suddenly we shifted our focus to, it's not what's wrong with you. This is not an abusive teacher who had a mental block against the kid. This is somebody who, realistically speaking, probably shouldn't have a child who's triggering that fear, and then she has to be the adult in the room every single day. We didn't take the child out of the class because I think she felt initially that we took the child out of the class because she's not a good enough teacher, or like we were judging her. And really, she was teaching that child fine. Like, the child was fine. It wasn't like there was any issue, but I just felt there would be a psychological burden for a little girl to be in a classroom where the primary adult in the room is disgusted by her all day long. Her sensory needs are not going to get fixed in a day. She's in therapy. She has OT. She has supports. She had learning challenges, so she has all those supports. It's going to take 2-3 years before this kid's collar is not constantly soaked with drool. Meanwhile, let her go into a classroom where the teacher just sees her as a human.
I love the question and actually the way you approach it. You do so well with this. Can you tell me a little bit about that situation? I think that's a fantastic approach, which really takes the judgment out of it and really is affirming to somebody. Because I think teachers and most adults in education take comments about what they're doing fairly personally. I don't know if that's been your experience, Steve, but
Yeah,
teachers
sure.
oh, suddenly by saying I have to change what I say, am I no longer a good person? Right. So they're very
Right.
sensitive. So I love that approach.
It's hard, especially with something like this that is so much more, it's so much more encoded in other psychological functions. She's a wonderful teacher. And I feel like, sure, she was doing her best. I just don't think in that situation the child needed to bear the brunt of that. Maybe years of trauma therapy and maybe more support. I feel like caregivers in general don't get nearly as much support as they should. So maybe if she had more support, because taking care of an ill person with an immune problem right after a pandemic is probably terrifying. So there's a lot. But in the interim, take the kid out of the class. We can teach you. In other words, if she comes to me and says, "Hey, I have this real problem with germs. I want help with it," there's help out there. That's actually one of the easier things to treat, right? We can definitely work with that. But in the interim, why have this 5-year-old be the like egg that's cracked in the process? And to me, there's no judgment. You're an amazing teacher that you're willing to say, "Okay, move her to the other class."
I had a situation, a number of support staff. There were 7 or 8 educational assistants, we called them in our schools, or parapros in some places they call them. And
Mm-hmm.
the group of them were having just a terrible time, and they were at each other, and the principal was at her wit's end. And so, and preparing for a meeting together, I talked with each one of them, and each one of them had a major situation at home, whether it was one person had a partner who had a stroke, another was dealing with a troubled teen, another was dealing with addictions, another one had just miscarried. It was like all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes that that nobody else knows about, right?
Yeah. And it's so hard, I feel like, because we talk about children having that invisible backpack, but adults have invisible backpacks too. And if you don't have some sort of a practice for unpacking it in some level or some way, it's really hard, especially since kids pick things up and they just see it as personal rejection.
Yes.
Yeah. Thinking of a whole school approach as a principal, as an administrator in a school, how do we become a trauma-informed school? What are the things that we need to have in place? What are the mechanisms that need to be there so that we can become better trauma-informed as a school?
So the most important thing I put in place is, first of all, starting with that team approach where everybody knows that we're a child-centered school. And our assumption always is if a child is acting out in some way, not so much like, how dare you do that, but why did you do that? Let's understand, because it may not be a trauma, it may be a skills deficit. You don't know how to politely talk to someone, or you don't know how to like handle a situation where you're under stress, so you just blurt out the first thing in your head, right? And we want the cafeteria staff to know that and the secretaries to know that. We want the school to be child-centered. Like, everybody is here because we are helping these children grow and reach their potential. We're all here to help the kids. Because I think it's important that the entire culture, everybody knows what we're doing. If we're using certain language for things, every teacher should know that language. If I have certain things that I teach in SEL, like the feedback formula. Everyone needs to know what the feedback formula is. Everybody needs to know, if I use this analogy of marbles and getting marbles with people and losing your marbles when you get really mad and then you lose your marbles. And everybody needs to know about marbles so that everybody can say to a kid, you can keep saying that, but you might lose some marbles. Is there a way to say it without losing marbles? Because I want the person who's supervising lunch and the person who's supervising outdoor play to know the analogy, because the whole point of an analogy is a shorthand. So you can say to a child, how do you ask that with whatever the analogy that we're using is, so that the kids just know. I really teaching kids, I call SEL the science of you. Like, I really like teaching kids about their own stress response, their own brain, their own conflict resolution skills, their own communication skills, so that they know this. Because first of all, it totally cuts down on so much of the way recess and lunch can spill into classroom time. Like, we're still in a fight about the volleyball game, and now we have to sit in class, but everyone's still darting angry glances at each other, and no one's paying attention to math because we're all still thinking about volleyball. If we have a mechanism for saying to the teacher, we just need to either resolve this or have a talk about talks, meaning we're not going to resolve the volleyball game till the next time we're on the playground, but let's all agree that before we start playing next time, we're going to have a conversation about what's the most fair way to handle this rule, right? Or something like that. And everyone's like, okay, agreed. And then we can really reinforce with adult attention the kid who said that. Yes, you were a great problem solver. Thank you for bringing that up. You know what? Then we can go on to math. So what did we lose? 5 minutes of the period, but now we have everybody's attention. And if we say, okay, we're putting volleyball into that box because when it's volleyball time, when it's handling this problem time, we're going to take it back out. We're teaching them a skill for life, right? We can switch our attention. We can focus on what's salient right now, even if something emotional is there. Right? That's an important skill for kids to learn. To me, that's more educational than the math lesson, but maybe that's because I'm better at psychology than math. I don't know, but I feel like learning to do that, it's key. So that's what I see as a trauma-informed school, teaching kids about themselves, like teaching them the science of you. I think where SEL becomes problematic is when teachers open up doors that they don't know how to close, or when they haven't been adequately trained, if there isn't ongoing support, where if you're doing SEL the way I conceive of it, there should be monthly meetings and refreshers and people bringing up like the way we do a treatment team in a psychology practice, where like everyone presents a case and we bring it up and we troubleshoot it together. So maybe we have the early elementary and the middle school, the high school, like different grade levels with some facilitators. Like, we were trying to use this approach and here's where I keep getting stuck, or my class keeps getting stuck. And the teachers can all say that. Or sometimes people know things and it just doesn't get communicated. I might be a neighbor of a family in the school and I know that they're going through a stressor, but nobody's told the school. But if I know and I can bring it up, like Sarah's dad lost his job recently, just mentioning it in case. The more information we have, the more we can do that. Inviting parents to tell us if stuff is going on for your kid, I want to hear about it. Email me, let me know, text me, whatever the mechanism. I don't think teachers should have their phones available to parents 24/7, but whatever your mechanism for communication is, if something's going on, let us know. Grandma's real sick, let us know. Because then we know. And the more we know, the more information we can use.
So where's the resistance to SEL coming from? Because when I think about schooling, those in senior leadership positions tend to ask more about math scores and language and reading scores than they ask about how things are going with SEL. So where's the resistance coming from, and what do you think we could do about it?
I think the resistance comes from two places. Either school districts that don't want to deal with parents who have an ideological problem with SEL for like, oh, that's just not how my grandma was taught kind of thing. They just don't want to deal with that. So I think there's a point for that. I actually had a fun experience with a principal. I was working with a real tough, no-nonsense guy. And he was like a former Marine. He was in many ways a fabulous educator in the sense of like, everything positive you can think of a really good sports coach. But I'm a back to basic school. We do math, we do science, we do social studies. Like, we focus on the basics because from a place of these kids are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds and I want to give them every advantage. And if you can't read, you can't do life. Like, that was his approach. And I pointed out to him, I said, first of all, science and social studies, this is science and social studies, right? I have a PhD in the science called psychology. It's all science, right? It's not chemistry, but they do teach us stuff in a place like New York University, right? We don't sit and arrange flowers all day. We learn something, and there's actually statistics in psychology. There's much. This is not a made up field. But then I pointed out the amount of disciplinary incidents that we could lower when we have these mechanisms. Like, by the end of the school year, he was sold. He was like, we want to bring this into more grades. We started with 5th grade. He's like, we want to bring this into more grades, because he realized, like, oh, when we're not so upset about whatever's going on, we can focus on learning. I can tell you a really funny story that happened to my mom. My mom was a public school guidance counselor starting in like the 1950s. And she was a real fan of guidance. And at one point in the 80s, there was this big push of a computer in every classroom. And my mom, and so the school had this referendum, because if they were going to put a computer in every classroom, then they had to cut the funding for counseling. So it was like my mom's position on the line. Like, she would still have a job because she had tenure, but she would have to move to a different school, and she really liked the school she was in. And there was this kid, Rosie, who was like the terror of the school, who like everybody knew about Rosie because she made herself known. And she got up and at this meeting, at this referendum in front of all these parents, and she said to this principal, she's like, Mr. Z, if you're saying if we have a computer in every classroom, then we're going to learn more math and more science and more social studies, and we'll have all these educational opportunities, and it's going to be great. Did you ever consider that if we don't have counseling, we won't want to learn math and science and social studies? Because I need to come in and tell somebody about everything my stepdad did last night and have a safe space to sit and like orient myself and prepare myself for the day. And then I can go into class and learn. But if I don't have counseling, I don't want to learn anything. And my mother always says, Rosie saved her job. And there was one of those kids where you think, am I getting through to her? Does she even care about what I'm doing for her?
Dr. Koslowitz uses trauma-informed practices to help educators manage their own emotional responses and understand how their personal experiences might impact their teaching. It's important to engage parents and the community in understanding and supporting trauma-informed practices and SEL in schools, and principals play a key role in facilitating this partnership. Find out more about our work with restorative practices and some very practical how-tos of inclusive conversations and building partnerships at www.restorative.ca. You can email me, stan@restorative.ca. We're not done with this conversation, so tune in next week for part 2 with Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, where she describes strategies to become a trauma-informed school community.